we are getting close to 5 years, and it's kind of crazy to think about that. It's just amazing how fast just time just kind of keeps going, right? And I think we all recognize that in our lives. If you've, and I'm going to say a lot of you, how many of you have been in Elgin for 10 years or less? 10 years or less. Yeah, that's the majority of who have come to Journey for the most part, right? And it'll be interesting because in another 10 years, it'll be interesting to see how those dynamics change. If all of a sudden we become, oh well, that's the church that people go to who've lived in Elgin all their lives, right? It's interesting how things change as time keeps marching on. But we're going to be talking about from here building up to September 15th, just kind of talking about who we are, what we're trying to do, where we're going. None of this is really going to be new stuff, right? It's just going to be talking about what we've been trying to do for the past 5 years, and okay, where is this going to lead us in the future? We're not doing a relaunch. There's a lot within church planning. A lot of times, they'll talk about doing a relaunch. Kind of give a new burst of energy, if you will. Well, in a way, we're celebrating where we've been. We're looking at where we're going. So hopefully there's energy that comes from that. But we're not changing everything up, right? We're not going to rebrand ourselves. That becomes and I can have been in lots of conferences and stuff like that talk about, sometimes it's important just to rebrand yourself every few years or whatever. And I do understand that. And I understand why it is helpful and why it works. But frankly, it's exhausting. And you're always working just to rebrand yourself, right? And what I think you're going to find as we talk about kind of journey and where we've been and all of this is that I don't know if this is going to work in that a lot of what we're trying to do doesn't fit conventional norms. And I understand that, and I'm not ignorant to that. Because a lot of the conventional ways of going about planting a church follow closely with starting a new business, right? And there are things that you do in starting a new business that are very necessary in order to get your business up and going, right? And there's things that you have to do as a church plant to get going. But I don't necessarily think those are always actually things churches should be doing, right? It's this weird tension that we have, right? And so we're going to constantly be working through that. And how do we do this better? And how do we, and understanding that, listen, we may not look like every other church, and that's every church can say that, right? Because every church is unique, right? But we're going to talk about how we're going to try to do things, understanding that it may be a little different. It probably does go against some conventional teaching of how you start a church. Right, so I started thinking, well, what do we need to start with? Where do we start as we start talking about journey? And that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with journey. Where did we come up with that name? What is that trying to convey? What's that trying to put in our thought process whenever you say journey? And so just a real quick history and rundown of our journey. I grew up in West Texas. We're not natives to this area, right? We grew up out in very dry desert, and people here that we're complaining now, and we're doing it like we're complaining that it hasn't rained in a while, and we look outside and, it's getting so dry. Like this looks like a tropical paradise to the wettest time in West Texas, right? And so grew up in that area, grew up very conservative background, grew up in a Methodist church, going to church all the time. That's always been a big part of our family. It still is a big part with my parents and all my brothers and sisters. And never thought I would get into ministry. Went to school, was asked to be a part-time youth minister in the summer while I was going to school. And they actually paid to do that. And so I was like, sure, I'll do that. And so I did that for like 3.5 years. Still didn't, and people were asking me during that time, and this was kind of within Methodist circles, they were like, so are you going to go to seminary? SMU, Perkins Seminary has a really nice seminary. You want to go there? And I was like, that makes me just sick thinking about going to seminary. What are you talking? I'm going to school right now. I'm just ready to be done. And they just get it. And so I was working on a business degree, and I was like, I just want to do that, and I just want to go and start working. I wasn't thinking of professional ministry in any way. And so I get my degree, move up to Lubbock, working in the very fast-moving business of selling pagers. It was, that was the right business to choose, right? And was doing that for a while. Then quickly realized, that may be bad. So I started working for Cisco Foods, and so I was in sales for Cisco Foods. And so you go to restaurants, and you realize you don't want to know what goes on in the restaurants. And I also realized I am not a salesman, because I would say, here's my flat of tomatoes, and it's $9. And they would say, well, I can get it for $8.58 from this guy over here. And I'd be like, I guess buy it from him. I mean, it's tomatoes, right? It's like, but it was like 10 cents difference. And I was like, man, okay, all right. So I was not a good salesman. And I realized this quickly. And it was during that time Molly and I get married. We've known each other since we were 6 years old. She grew up in Abilene, across the street from my grandparents, and so we've known each other forever. She was going to Tech at the time, and so we get married. And it was then that I really started realizing, maybe God is wanting me to be in ministry, because I was missing it. And I realized, that was something I enjoyed. But I didn't know what to do. I didn't know, what's that next step, right? And so it's like, well, I guess I'll go to seminary. It's like, and really didn't want to at that time. And got a phone call from a guy that we had met in San Angelo through some things that I had done with youth. And he said, hey, we're looking for a full-time youth pastor. And I was like, okay, I'm interested. And it was First Presbyterian Church in San Angelo. And I was like, I have no idea what a Presbyterian is. And they were like, that's okay. It doesn't matter. And I told them, I said, I've been thinking about going to seminary. And if I go to seminary, I was going to go to Hardin-Simmons, because that's where I went to get my undergraduate. And I was like, they have a seminary. I'll just do that. It was no connection that it was even Baptist. In my mind, I don't think in those terms. And so I was like, I'm familiar with Hardin-Simmons. They have a seminary. I'll just go there. And they were like, okay, that's fine. So I was there for about 3 years doing full-time youth ministry. And during that time, realized I'm not going to be a youth minister for my whole life. Now I'm back doing some of that. But knew that I probably needed to go to seminary, because at that time that was the route that you took, right? And so go to Abilene, go to seminary there. Baptist. There was a lot of similarities with my theology, but then you realize that Baptists are all over the place. They are schizophrenic to the max, right? And they are everywhere. I mean, you've got hardcore fundamentals, and then you've got what would be, fairly liberal, right? Just the whole spectrum. And Hardin-Simmons was kind of in the middle of that. And it was kind of interesting. I really appreciated that, because I got to see it a lot. But that led to me being a pastor in Cisco, Texas, at Calvary Baptist Church. Finished seminary there. I was there for another 3 years. Then we were in Sweetwater at First Baptist Church there for about 5 years before coming here. And it was during our time at Sweetwater, I guess what you would consider the stereotypical county seat Baptist church, right? First Baptist Church. And I'd been feeling this before, but realizing, there is a difference between kind of the established way that we've been doing church and kind of, does that fit with kind of the where the country is going, where style is going, where just what people are looking for, where that's going. Does that established model? The church does, yes, no doubt. But what's the model going to look like? And I still believe, and I'm still a defender of the established churches. Like, it is important that we have established churches here in Elgin and everywhere. though they provide a huge role and they meet the needs of a lot of people. However, I think we can all agree there's a big portion of society that is needs are not being met by those established churches, right? And frankly, they're not being met by any church because it's tough. It's a constant. You're trying to reach people for the cause of Christ, right? And so that's when we started realizing, is this the setting that we want to be in for the rest of ministry career, whatever it looks like? And the answer quickly was becoming no, and then it was no, and then some words that went in front of no, but it was like, well, what do you do? Where do you go from this? And I had a friend who said that he was going to plant a church. He actually asked me to come help him. This was about 2.5 years before we actually came to Elgin. And I was like, church planting? What is that, right? It is kind of weird. There's always been churches that have been started. But in the 90s and in the early 2000s, by 2010, it was definitely a full movement, right, of a different style of planting churches, right? And I had never considered that, thought of that, but we started looking at it. I brought it up to Molly, and she was like, no, we're not doing that. And I kind of agreed with her at that time, but as God continued to work, we realized, okay, I think that's where God's wanting us to go. And we found Nexus. They're a great organization that helps you get started. Went to their assessment process. It's basically a 3-day interview, and you do all kinds of stuff. And it was a little nerve-wracking whenever because they do a personality test, right? And just so that you know where you are. I mean, this is common stuff. And they looked at us and said, we've never had someone plan a church with your personality. I was like, do I have that bad of a personality? I was like, oh my gosh. And I was like, I better become a better tomato salesman. But what they were talking about is I am not a kind of high A or D, the dominant personality, right? That's typically the people who plant churches, and I'm going to say over 90% of the people that plant churches are kind of in that range. That means they are goal-oriented, they are get it done, they are moving forward, and it's kind of like, hey, I'm moving, and you come along with me, and I'll pull you, or I'll just let you go, right? Sometimes that's good, and it's needed. Sometimes it's not. My personality is actually to be more comfortable behind the scenes. And there was a psychologist that was there that, just talks about all kinds of stuff. And he told me, he said, this is something you're going to have to work, because he said, you have to operate as if you're a type A, type D person. You are the front man, but you prefer to be back here. And he said it's going to be tough, right? And I've noticed that there's a tension there, right? And but they said you need to plant a church. So it was actually great affirmation when they look at you and they tell you, no, you need to do this. And we didn't match up. They plant non-denominational churches, but they're within the Christian church realm, which the Church of Christ and the Christian church were one 100 years ago, and then one wanted music and one didn't. And so the Christian church has music, is not as fundamental as the Church of Christ. But that's kind of most of them come from that place. We obviously didn't, right? I've collected a paycheck from a Methodist church, Presbyterian church, and Baptist church, right? And so that's never been a big deal. And they were like, no, that's okay. So actually one of the churches that was a major contributor to getting Journey started is the biggest Church of Christ in Midland, Texas, right? That's pretty cool, right? And then they could care less that we're not anywhere close to Church of Christ, right? And so it's been this interesting journey that's gotten us to this place. And so we started looking around, and they talked about the Austin area. We didn't want to come into the city center. We wanted something outside, and Elgin fit that. Elgin was outside. There weren't a whole lot of church plants in the area. It was a place that was small but was growing. So those were all things that led us here to Elgin, and God was just in that, and things fell together. And so as we get here, we're trying to figure out, well, what's our name going to be? And we are connected with Journey Christian Community, which is up in just outside of Waco and China Spring. Still have a relationship with them, nothing official, but just talk with them. And their name was Journey, and they were a financial supporter as well. And that name just kind of hit us, and we started thinking about it. It's like, that name fits what we're trying to be. Because here's the reality is we're all on a journey, right? That life, if you want to look at it, your life is just one big journey. And it goes all over the place, right? Our life has been up and down and twist and turn, but it's all on a journey. And we're like, okay, you know what? We want to create a church that allows people to come wherever they are in their journey, to come together and start doing life together, and that we recognize that we have something in common, and that something that holds us together, and that's our love for God and God's love for us, and that we start going through that journey together as much as we can, understanding there is no community that you can just say, okay, the community is going to completely take care of me now. No, this is still your journey, but we want to be part of it, right? And so whenever I think of journey, it is our journey, whenever we talk about Journey Elgin Church, but really it's about your journey, right? And now it's brought each one of you here for whatever reason. Sometimes I still don't know why. I don't know why anyone, it's like, I don't know how anyone found out about us, because I'm not good at the business stuff, right? And it's really cool to see how God has done that. And to kind of take a big picture of it, it's like God is working, everybody has their own journey, and somehow those paths have crossed here, and on Sundays we come here, and then we go back out into our worlds, and our journey continues, right? Well, that's what we want to be about, right? And so whenever I think about that, what does that journey look like? Well, there's a few different ways that I think this has been talked about, especially as you're starting a church or starting a business. One of the illustrations that a lot of times are used is running a race, right? So whenever you're starting a business, starting a church, you think of it as a race, right? There's a couple of different kinds of races. The first is the sprint, right? Now, we all know that's probably not the best way, but if we're honest, that's how a lot of times we start. And sometimes you have to start that way. So what's the dynamics of a sprint, right? You get down in the blocks, and when that gun goes off, you hit it as hard as you can and go for as long as you can, right? And whenever you're starting a new church or a new business, you feel like you have to do that, right? Because it is terrifying. If you've started something new that's going to provide you income or anything like that, or that's important to you, you feel like, man, I've got to run as fast as I can. And it's an interesting feeling, because you're like, I don't even know if what I'm doing is right, but I know I've got to just go, right? I've just got to keep going. And what you realize is that you start tiring out fairly quickly, right? And that eventually you cannot, it is physically impossible to keep up that kind of a pace. We see this in the business world all the time, right? Y'all remember the dot-com boom, right? The dot-coms came up. I still don't really know what that means, except they were somehow on the interweb, and man, they would come in and just boom, they're doing stuff, and they were reaching thousands and thousands of people and making absolutely no profit, right? But it was a sprint. And I think Google is a good example of this. Man, when they first hit the scene, it's a sprint. They're just doing everything they can, throwing stuff out there, seeing what sticks, hoping that it'll eventually start bringing some stability, right? What happened to most of the dot-coms? They got to the finish line, or it wasn't the finish line, but they became exhausted because it was a sprint, right? We do this in the church world too. Man, when you plant a church, they give you kind of some step-by-step, here's some things that you need to start doing. And you start getting out in the community. You start throwing movie nights. You start doing all of this stuff, none of which is bad, by the way, right? But it can be exhausting, right? And what happens if you stay in the sprint mindset, you are going to get to a point where you're exhausted. And if you're lucky, you can survive that in time to catch your breath. But if you stay in the sprint mindset, then you just start sprinting again, right? And churches do this. I think this is kind of the way, if you look at it, okay, we've got to keep rebranding ourselves. That's nearly one sprint after another, right? Okay, we're doing this. We're great for 5 years. Now we're going to change it all up because we've got to create some more excitement. We've got to reach new people. And so we're going to start something new. So it's just kind of these constant sprints. And you hope that you can survive whenever everyone's just exhausted, right? So that's one way that you can go through your journey. And by the way, this applies to your life as well. I think we do this in our life. Sometimes we view life as a sprint. It's like, hey, we've got to get it all done right now. You know, talking to my daughter, Kaylee, and she, they're talking about college and careers, and they're being bombarded with all this stuff and trying to, okay, well, what are you going to do? What are you going to do next? And I'm sitting there saying, ooh, calm down. You don't have to make all these decisions this month, right? It's okay, right? It's all right. But we are encouraged to live as a sprint, right? That's kind of how we're encouraged. But no, you can't live that way. And our church can't function that way, right? So then we keep the same example, but the next is, well, okay, we need to treat this as what? A marathon, right? A marathon. I understand this. I agree with this to much more than the sprint, right? So a marathon, you pace yourself, right? So you know that goal is out there. So you slow down, you pace yourself, and you start running, and you just keep going. There's going to be times that you're really exhausted, but you power through, and you keep going. This is a healthier way to approach life. It's a healthier way to approach business. I look at it. Google, I think, has nearly got to the marathon stage, right? Where now they've kind of got their core things that they do. This doesn't mean they're not doing new stuff. Coke is probably even a better example. Coca-Cola, they made a mistake back in the 80s with New Coke, and they nearly died. But then they realized, okay, now we've got Coke and we've got Diet Coke. We can tinker with orange vanilla Coke, but you know what? It doesn't really matter. We are just running this marathon, right? That's the same thing with churches. You can get into that mode where, okay, we're just going to keep moving forward. I think that's a much healthier view. Here's the only thing that I think we have to be careful with is when you're running a marathon, it's still a marathon, and it still can get completely exhausting, right? And what happens if you're running a marathon, you still have this viewpoint that, hey, we've got to get to the finish line, we've got to get to the goal, and you know what? We kind of want to beat the other people too. So there's those times that you're pretty tired, but you're like, you know what? No, we're going to have a little burst of energy. I need to go catch that guy right there, right? And so you expend a burst of energy, and then you're still exhausted, right? And I think we can see that in churches, and I think there needs to be a little bit of a tweak here, because we're not running a race. Guess what? We don't have to win anything because it's already been won, right? Like our goal, and this is hard to say. Our goal is not to continue existing. Right? Like if our only goal is to grow our church and to make sure that this organization continues, we better have a sprint at time and a marathon at time mentality, right? Because we're going to have to create marketing things. We're going to have to create things to get people interested. But the reality is that's not our goal. Our goal is to live life as Christ and impact his kingdom. And guess what? That should be our goal whether Journey exists or not. Okay? So now there's some subtlety here, but I think it's important to understand. The reason that we do things or don't do things, we've got to be real careful. It should never be about the fact, okay, we've just got to increase our tithes and our offerings, or we've got to increase people in the seats. It can't be that way. And sometimes if you take the marathon or especially the sprint approach, that kind of can be what it becomes. All right? Now, I know there's a hybrid because the reality is we do want to continue, right? We do want to grow, right? And we want to be intentional about that, but that is never going to be our main focus. I can remember sitting down and having, in fact, I had lunch with him the other day. He was in Bastrop, at a church in Bastrop. They are around 10 years old, probably 12 years old now, church plant. And whenever I first came to Elgin and was visiting with him, and he said, yeah, we've just are launching our 2020 campaign. And that goal, they wanted to be at 2,000 members or average attendance by 2020. And they were talking about it, and it's all good stuff. You're like, we want to reach the kingdom of God for Christ, and we want to get to 2,000 people coming. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I would just crawl in a hole if that's how I was measuring where we're going. That would terrify me, because if that's the case, like, we need to get all of our resources and just put it into marketing. We need to buy the billboard by Southside and put our name up there. We've got to, because that is the only way that you can get that many people, right? Because I believe that the way that you get people is through relationships. That takes time, and it's slow, right? And you have to be okay with that, and we are, right? And so we've got to be really careful about that. And yet at the same time, I would love, okay, that'd be great to have a large church. But that is not the goal. Never can that be the goal. And so as I started thinking, I was like, I don't like the sprint. I don't like the marathon. And then I remembered whenever I was in elementary, probably junior high, we went to the Davis Mountains. Right? And the Davis Mountains are kind of crazy that there's these cool mountain range in Texas. It doesn't make any sense, but it's there. And our whole goal was we were hiking up to this natural spring way up in there, and you could go swimming in it. Not a good idea. It was freezing. But that was our goal. But we got there like on a Friday or Saturday morning, something like that, and our hike began. So it was basically a nature hike. And what we would do is we'd be walking, and we're always headed towards this spring, but then we would see a plant over here, and our guide would say, this is this kind of plant. It only grows here or whatever. And, at that time, it was like, okay, whatever. But then there'd be some, wildlife that you would see, and you would talk about it. Then we would sit, and we would, unpack our bags, and we learned some survival skills. Then all of a sudden they'd take time to, okay, here's how you make a fire. So we'd make a fire. All of this is on this nature hike. Then there'd be other trails off of this nature hike, and they'd say, well, you know what, you can go up there, and this is a ridge that you can go look off. So we'd go on this trail. We'd go look at the ridge, and then we'd make our way back down, and then we'd start on the nature hike again, right? Then we actually spent the night, so we camped along this trail. And so we took our time, we made campfires, we cooked, all of that stuff, and then eventually we finally got to the place that we were going. But it was a long time. We did a whole lot of other stuff while we were going, and I started thinking about that. That's actually the journey of life, right? Your journey and your life, it's not a marathon. It's sure not a sprint, or you'd already be dead by now, right? But if it's a marathon, sometimes you just get in the mode, it's like, oh, I just got to keep going. I got to keep going. You know what? Sometimes you just need to sit down, and you need to camp, and you need to spend the night. You need to get rejuvenated. Sometimes you need to take a little trail, kind of divert yourself a little bit, right? You need to be rejuvenated, all knowing you're still going to this spot, right? And guess what? That spot's still going to be there, right? And you can still achieve your goal by doing some different things. We're going to be really flexible here at Journey. And the passage there's just two verses. And we'll talk about this more, but it's Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. It says, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." That translation is offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. What that is talking about and kind of wrapped up in there is, listen, offer your ordinary, plain, daily life as a sacrifice to God. That you recognize that your ordinary, normal life is actually a sacrifice that you are giving to God, that you are doing it for him. Right? See, we have gotten, in our society, we've messed things up so much that we feel like to do something that matters, we have to do something big, right? Like we have to change the world somehow, come up with a new idea, invent something, create a movement, right? Become passionate about something, overly passionate nearly, right? But you know what? When those things come, that's great. When God puts that in front of you, wonderful. But the reality is most of our life is just ordinary days. And you know what? You can glorify God through that, right? When you are going to work, even if your work is not perfect, right? You do that unto the Lord, right? That you are providing for your family. You are doing what you're supposed to do. We were created to work, right? That is part of offering your life, your normal everyday life to God, right? And that's what we want to be here at Journey. We're all kind of on this nature hike together, right? We're moving towards, we're going to make an impact in God's kingdom. We're going to strive to live life as Christ, but it's going to look different. And sometimes it's going to feel like, you know what, we're just kind of camping. That's okay, right? Sometimes we're going to go down this little trail. Sometimes we're going to go down this one. But all of it is still moving towards the goal. Moving towards living our life for Christ, changing our perspective, right? That passage talks about looking at the world differently. And it talks about just allowing God in us and through us to make a difference. That's what we're going to be. It's going to be simple. It's not going to be very flashy. We're not going to rebrand ourselves all the time. But I hope that it is something that you realize, man, this is what I need in my journey. Right? I need something that is there all the time, something that provides encouragement, that provides motivation, that provides a shoulder to cry on, right? Because we're all in this journey together, and we want to be a part of yours. And Journey Church doesn't happen without all of your journeys, and we want you to be a part of it, and we really look forward to what God's going to be doing in the years to come. Let's go to him in prayer.